The storm was closing in fast when Caleb pulled his car onto a lonely turnoff along the Blue Ridge Parkway. Mist clung to the ground. Headlights carved pale tunnels through the drizzle, and Serena's smirk cut sharper than the rain. Caleb's voice was clipped, cold, rehearsed. "Get out. You need a lesson? My son, the boy I once held through fevers and long nights of homework, was gone, replaced by a man determined to prove himself by discarding me." Gravel crunched beneath my shoes as I stepped out, and the car disappeared into the dark, tail lights bleeding red against the storm. I stood still, letting the rain soak through me, refusing to panic. That was what they wanted. Then, from behind an abandoned gas station, headlights appeared. Reed Dawson's black Ford truck rolled forward, steady as ever. He had been waiting, just as we planned. Caleb thought he had left me powerless on a mountain road. He was wrong. He had given me exactly what I needed. Reed opened the door without a word, and I climbed in, the leather seat damp beneath my coat. He drove us through the thickening storm, the wipers keeping time with the pounding in my chest. By the time we reached Asheville, neon motel lights flickered against wet pavement. Inside the small room reserved under my maiden name, safety came in the smell of bleach and worn carpet. Reed set his hat down, his voice low. "I told you he'd escalate." He was right. Months earlier, strange bills had appeared under my name repairs I never authorized, signatures that didn't look like mine. When I confronted Caleb, he brushed me off with practiced irritation. That was when I called Miriam Keats, an attorney with a reputation for elder law. She told me to document everything, tonight. I had proof. Reed uploaded the audio of Caleb's words, "You need a lesson. Walk home," onto encrypted drives, pressing a cold flash drive into my hand. "Now it can't be buried," he said. The metal felt heavier than gold. Sleep did not come. I lay in the narrow motel bed, rain tapping the window, memories flooding in with each drop. Years of sacrifice blurred together, the sewing machine humming deep into the night so Caleb could have new shoes. Skipped meals so his plate could be full. The gold wedding band pawned to cover his first semester at Chapel Hill. My devotion had been constant, unremarkable in its rhythm, until Serena arrived. She whispered poison into his ear, twisting care into control, sacrifice into suffocation. Slowly, my son absorbed her story until my love became chains in his mind. That wound cut deeper than tonight's storm. The next morning, Miriam met me in her cramped office, her desk buried in binders and glowing laptop screens. She slid invoices across the table, her voice brisk but careful. Roof repairs, HVAC replacements, foundation reinforcement. More than $30,000. All forged in your name. My stomach twisted. The house had needed none of it. The trail led straight into Serena's boutique account, shuttered after unpaid loans. Caleb had signed everything, cloaking theft in the guise of maintenance. Reed leaned back, shaking his head. 6 months ago I heard him in a bar bragging he was managing your assets, said he was finally in charge. His words stung more than the forged signatures. Pride and betrayal was harder to bear than theft. That afternoon, Jonah slipped into the motel lobby, eyes wide and nervous, without a word. He pressed a folded slip of paper into my hand before hurrying back to his father's car. His uneven handwriting said, "Dad says you don't matter." I don't believe him. My throat tightened. Caleb might believe Serena's lies, but Jonah's quiet act reminded me not all bonds had been broken. That night, I opened the old sewing kit I had carried for decades. Hidden inside was an envelope yellowed at the edges, the original LLC agreement my husband had drafted, granting me sole voting rights over the bungalow and land. Caleb's name was nowhere. For years, I had lived uneasy, signing documents he placed before me. But this, notarized and intact, was the foundation that mattered. The following morning, Reed drove me to the bank on Patton Avenue. A brass key opened the safe deposit box where my husband's documents waited the deed, a confirming side letter, and his note in steady hand, "Protect this. One day you may need it." Tears blurred the ink. He had seen the danger long before I admitted it. Miriam copied and certified every page, returning the originals to me. For the first time in months, my chest expanded fully. The house was mine. The land was mine. Caleb had only been trespassing. By afternoon, we were in Buncombe County Courthouse. Caleb sat stiff at the respondent's table, Serena beside him in her blazer, tension flickering in her eyes. Jonah hunched behind them, sneakers scuffing the floor. The judge called order, iron gray hair framing eyes that missed nothing. Miriam rose, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Your Honor, last night my client was abandoned 98 miles from home in an isolated turnoff. She played the audio." Caleb's voice filled the courtroom walk home. 98 miles should teach you respect. The silence that followed was heavier than stone. Miriam laid out forged invoices, the boutique transfers, and the notarized deed from the bank. One by one, Caleb's false authority dissolved. The judge leaned forward. "Tone final. All joint assets are frozen pending review. Exclusive property rights to the Marlowe bungalow are restored to Mrs. Isolda Marlowe. A temporary stay-away order is issued against Caleb Marlowe and Serena Hale Marlowe." The gavel cracked. Caleb slammed his palm against the table, muttering curses. But the power had been stripped in open court. Jonah's eyes lifted to me, and for a fleeting second, I saw understanding. The truth had been spoken aloud. Outside the courthouse, the autumn air was crisp and cool, but I felt no relief. Victories in courtrooms do not erase wounds carried home. Reed walked beside me, silent but steady, while Miriam hurried off with her team to file the necessary motions. Caleb's glare still burned in my mind, but the gavel had done its work. His power had been stripped, and for once, the law had spoken clearly. Yet I knew this was only the first crack. Serena was not the sort to collapse quietly, and Caleb, blinded by her whispers, would not surrender easily. Miriam's team combed through Serena's history with meticulous care. Within days, a thick dossier arrived at my motel room. Serena's boutique had been only the latest of her failures. There were unpaid loans dating back a decade, lawsuits from creditors, even a guardianship petition filed years ago for her elderly aunt. The petition had been denied when a judge determined her motives were financial, not protective. Phone records revealed a steady diet of suspicion she had been feeding Caleb, text messages painting me as unstable, urging him to act before it was too late. The more he listened, the more he believed, until sacrifice itself became evidence against me. The district attorney's voice carried the weight of finality when he reviewed Miriam's findings. "This isn't just a family dispute," he said. "It bears the hallmarks of elder abuse and fraud. We're opening a formal inquiry." Vindication mingled with grief inside me. To know that Serena's ambition had turned my son into an accomplice was one wound. To learn she had a pattern of it was another. I had been targeted not because I was weak, but because I was steady. And steadiness, to Serena, was soil to be stripped bare. Jonah appeared again at the motel lobby, his backpack slung carelessly but his eyes alert. Reed excused himself to take a call outside, and Jonah leaned toward me. "She's scared," he whispered. I heard her say on the phone, "If they find out, we're finished." She doesn't want Dad to know how bad it is. His words trembled with the weight of a child holding a secret too heavy for his age. I touched his arm, careful not to push him further, but grateful. It was enough to know Serena's scaffolding of lies was beginning to buckle. The next morning, Reed drove me back to the bungalow. The house smelled faintly of dust, but it was mine again, legally and wholly. Reed changed out the locks methodically while I sorted through papers at the kitchen table, transferring utilities and insurance back into my name. Each small document felt heavier than any jewel, proof that what had been taken had been restored. That afternoon, Jonah arrived with grocery bags almost too heavy for him to carry. He set them down with a relieved sigh. "It feels better here," he said softly. I pressed my hand to his shoulder in silent gratitude. We were unpacking when a sharp knock rattled the door. Caleb's voice thundered through the wood. "Open up, Mother! This is still my house! Before I could rise!" Reed stood at the door, frame unyielding. Caleb's demands grew louder, Serena's voice urging behind him. Jonah froze, clutching a bag like a shield. Slowly, I walked forward, laid a hand on Reed's arm, and turned the lock myself. I closed the door, not with anger, but with quiet finality. The click echoed louder than his shouting. Jonah exhaled, and I felt the air shift. The door was closed, but my resolve was open. The lawsuit pressed forward with speed. Miriam filed claims of fraud and conversion, and depositions began within weeks. Serena broke first. Faced with her own record and the guardianship petition for her aunt, she folded, admitting her role in siphoning funds through forged invoices. She settled and fled back to Charlotte, leaving Caleb alone to face the court. He lashed out, violating the stay-away order twice, pounding on my porch door after dark until neighbors called the police. The second time, Reed was beside me, phone already in hand. Flashing blue lights cut through the night, and Caleb was led away in handcuffs. Watching my son in the back of a patrol car was not victory. It was grief sharpened by necessity. I had not raised him to be a thief, but ambition and manipulation had carved him into someone I scarcely recognized. Jonah did not speak of it directly, but his actions grew louder than words. On Fridays, he arrived with his backpack, staying through Sunday without complaint. We cooked together, tended the garden, sat in the quiet where no one demanded performance. The bond stitched itself back, thread by thread. Restlessness pushed me beyond my own healing. At the senior center downtown, I sponsored a clinic day, inviting attorneys and accountants to teach others about trusts, deeds, and protections against exploitation. The room filled with men and women clutching folders of questions, their faces etched with the same fear I once carried. When I stood at the front, introducing Miriam and thanking Reed, I felt something shift deep inside. For years, my voice had been dismissed, my choices twisted, my sacrifices misread. Now I was no longer a victim, but a teacher, passing on what I had learned at great cost. The applause at the end lingered like sunlight. That evening, back in my bungalow, I wrapped my hands around a warm mug of coffee. The framed deed hung on the wall, no longer hidden in a sewing kit or buried in a vault, but standing openly as declaration. Jonah sat at the table, pencil tapping against the margin of his homework. He glanced up, offered me a shy smile, and bent back to his work. Reed arrived with his boots damp from rain, placing a small key in my palm. "Don't think you'll need this anymore." I pressed it back into his hand. The locks were mine, but the strength was my own. The storm had once been Caleb's weapon. Now it was memory. I had disappeared from his grasp, only to reappear in my own life whole, unbroken, and stronger than he could ever have imagined. Rain had always been a quiet companion in my life, but now it seemed like a witness. Each storm carried echoes of nights spent at the sewing machine, patching gowns so Caleb could walk proudly among his classmates, or evenings when I gave up supper so he could eat more. Those sacrifices had been invisible until Serena twisted them into shackles in his mind. Yet standing in my own kitchen again, watching Jonah lean over his homework while Reed finished installing the last lock, I realized that what Serena tried to erase could not be erased. Devotion might be rewritten in someone else's story, but truth has a way of enduring in the long light of time. Still, peace was fragile. Caleb's anger did not die quietly. The first time he returned after his arrest, it was midnight, his fists pounding against my porch door. His shouts rattled the windows, but the neighbors called the police before he could force his way in. The second time, Reed was with me. Caleb's voice cracked with fury, Serena's silhouette shifting nervously behind him, until blue lights swept across the lawn and carried him away again. The charge was contempt of court, a word that sounded sterile, but carried the weight of broken bonds. Watching my son led away under flashing sirens was a grief I carried in silence. Jonah, though, was beginning to see clearly. He stopped asking questions that betrayed Serena's influence, stopped repeating her words about me. Instead, he lingered on weekends, helping me dig into the soil behind the bungalow, planting herbs and tomatoes where weeds had once grown. He seemed to breathe more easily in the small, ordinary rhythms of our days. We cooked simple meals together, and sometimes he would look at me with a quiet apology in his eyes, though he never spoke it aloud. I did not need the words. His presence was enough. Miriam pressed forward with relentless determination. She and her team unearthed every shadow Serena had left behind, lawsuits stretching back years, tax liens hidden in county records, even a history of exploiting her own relatives under the guise of care. Piece by piece, Serena's reputation crumbled until even Caleb could no longer deny her lies. But denial is not the same as remorse. He refused to testify against her, refused to accept fault, clinging to his anger like a shield. The district attorney expanded the investigation, framing Serena's actions not just as family betrayal, but as part of a broader pattern of elder exploitation. For me, the words were both vindication and sorrow. To be counted among the exploited was painful, but to know that my fight might protect others gave the suffering shape. Miriam arranged another community session at the senior center, and this time I stood at the front with her. My voice trembled at first, but as I told my story of forged signatures, abandoned roads, and hidden deeds, it steadied. Faces in the crowd nodded, some with tears, some with fierce determination. In that hall, I was not only defending myself, I was passing on the strength to others. One evening, as Jonah sat reading at the table and Reed lingered by the doorway with his quiet watchfulness, I opened a separate folder Miriam had given me. Inside were forms for a modest trust in Jonah's name. My hands shook as I filled them out, transferring what savings I could into his future. It was not just money, it was a promise that something good would outlast the harm. When I told him about it, his eyes widened, but he did not protest. Instead, he leaned against me for a long moment, his head resting lightly on my shoulder. Serena's collapse came swiftly. Faced with mounting evidence, she agreed to settlement terms that barred her from any financial dealings involving vulnerable individuals. She left for Charlotte in haste, her influence drained. Caleb, left to face the courts alone, grew more volatile. He violated the stay-away order again, and this time the judge's patience thinned. He was fined heavily and warned that further breaches would bring jail time. Still, his pride could not bend. Pride is a cruel master, I thought, watching from a distance as his world shrank to anger and denial. Yet life inside the bungalow began to blossom again. Jonah's laughter returned in small bursts. Reed's presence filled the empty spaces with steadiness, and even the air seemed to move differently, lighter, cleaner. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to hang new curtains in the windows, to place flowers on the kitchen table without fearing they might be swept aside in someone else's rage. I moved through each day with the quiet joy of belonging to myself again. One morning, I woke before dawn, the house hushed and safe. I poured coffee into a chipped mug and stood by the window, watching the mist rise from the trees beyond the yard. The framed deed hung proudly on the wall, no longer a secret lifeline, but a visible declaration. My husband's handwriting in that old note, "Protect this," had guided me through storms he never lived to see. I traced the words in my memory, knowing he had trusted me with more than property. He had trusted me to survive. Jonah stirred awake, padding into the kitchen with sleepy eyes and hair tousled from sleep. "Morning, Grandma," he said softly, sliding into a chair with his textbook. That single word Grandma carried more healing than I could measure. It was proof that love, though wounded, still breathed. I handed him toast, and as Reed knocked gently on the door, his boots wet from the grass, I felt the circle of my life closing into something whole again. The storms had been many, but storms always pass. What remains is the strength built in their wake. The courthouse battles stretched on longer than I had imagined, each hearing another test of endurance. Miriam remained steadfast, her arguments sharp and unflinching, her evidence lined up like bricks in a wall no one could climb. Caleb tried to sneer through it, but every document, every forged invoice, every bank transfer traced back to Serena's schemes, and his complicity was plain. I watched him shift in his chair, jaw clenched, shoulders rigid. This was not the boy I had raised with late-night study sessions and scraped together tuition payments. This was a man drowning in his own pride, too stubborn to call for help. Jonah attended quietly, sitting behind me most days. Sometimes I caught him looking from me to his father, the conflict etched deep in his young face. His sneakers scuffed the floor, his hands knotted in his lap. But when our eyes met, I saw something steady growing inside him, a knowledge that truth had its own power, even when it was painful. After court one afternoon, he slipped me another folded note. "Don't give up. I see you." The words were small, but they carried me more than any judgment filed in the record. Serena, stripped of her defenses, retreated further into silence. When pressed during depositions, she admitted what could no longer be denied. Forged invoices, siphoned funds, lies whispered into Caleb's ear. Her voice lost its edge, her answers clipped and weary. The settlement she signed barred her from financial dealings with elders, a bitterly fitting end for someone who had built her power on exploitation. She left for Charlotte with little more than her shame trailing behind her. Yet Caleb clung to her, even as her influence disintegrated. He could not admit he had been deceived. To do so would mean admitting he had betrayed me for nothing. One evening, Reed and I returned to the bungalow after a long day in court to find Jonah already there. A stack of groceries set on the counter. He looked around the kitchen with an ease that made my heart ache. "It feels like home here," he said simply. I reached out, touching his arm, unable to speak past the tightness in my throat. Home. The word landed heavier than stone, but sweeter than any treasure. The seasons shifted, autumn winds giving way to the brittle air of winter. Life settled into rhythms again. Jonah stayed most weekends. Reed's quiet company steadied the nights, and I poured my energy into helping others through the senior center clinics. Each person who arrived carried their own story of fear, confusion, or betrayal. And in each face, I saw echoes of myself. But this time, I stood not as a victim, but as someone who had survived. My story became a lantern in dark places. Proof that even when storms take everything, there is strength in what remains. Caleb, however, did not fade into silence. His anger flared in small, desperate ways, letters scrawled in bitterness, voicemails that blended accusation with denial. Twice more he appeared at the bungalow, once with fists pounding, once with words dripping venom through the door. Each time, Reed was there, his presence a solid wall between me and the storm. The law responded firmly. Fines, warnings, threats of jail time. But the real punishment came not from the courts. It came from the emptiness his anger carved around him. Friends turned away. Serena fled. Jonah gravitated toward me. Caleb stood increasingly alone, his fury a cage he had built himself. One night, after Jonah had gone to bed, I sat on the porch with Reed. The autumn leaves had fallen, leaving the trees stark against the night sky. Reed handed me a small metal key, the last of the locks he had changed when I returned to the bungalow. "Don't think you'll need this anymore," he said quietly. I held it for a moment, then pressed it back into his hand. "Keep it," I whispered. The locks were mine. Yes, but the strength to stand behind them was something we had built together. Inside, the framed deed hung proudly on the wall, no longer hidden in a sewing kit, no longer a secret lifeline. It was a declaration, a promise kept. Jonah's laughter carried from his room, a sound so ordinary yet so precious. For years, my sacrifices had been twisted into chains, my love recast as manipulation. But truth had finally spoken. The house was mine, the land was mine, and my voice, once silenced, was steady again. I had lost much trust in a son who chose pride over love. Years poured into sacrifice misunderstood, but I had gained something greater, a freedom that came not from courts or deeds, but from reclaiming myself. Life, I realized, is not measured by storms endured, but by what we choose to build once the skies clear. And I had built something worth keeping. The storm had taken its toll, but it had also washed me clean. I stepped outside again, breathing deep of the cool night air. The road ahead was mine now, and though Caleb's shadow lingered, it no longer defined me. I had disappeared from his grasp only to reappear fully in my own life whole, unbroken and stronger than he could have ever imagined. If this story moved you, remember to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful true life stories. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my place?